Here's a news flash. You can't be good at every role in Valorant. There are times where you may feel like you're performing worse than usual. During these times, many are quick to blame their raw aim. While that may certainly be the case, you might just be playing the wrong role. The agent and role you select significantly affects how you play the game. If your playstyle doesn't match up with the role you've chosen, or perhaps you simply don't know how to play the said role, that's what we're here for. Today, we will be going over 3 tips for every role. This will expand your agent pool while also getting you more comfortable with your main agents. Before we get into it, this video is just a glimpse of what we can offer you. If you want a full detailed guide on how to improve in Valorant, then you want to check out our website at SkillCapped.com. More on that at the end of the video. First up, let's figure out what our primary role is and what suits our playstyle best. This is important to identify. Most professional players specialize in one particular role because that's what best matches their playstyle and allows them to perform at their best. You can't be the best at everything. We've seen players get placed outside of their usual roles and they perform significantly worse as they're not used to that style. Finding the right role depends on how you like to play the game. We will simplify this for you. If you're an aggressive player that likes to take duels and get into the enemy's face, you should play Duelists who specialize in doing just that. If you're a more passive player, then Sentinels and Controllers may be a fitting role for you. With Sentinels, you have various traps to make plays off of, while on Controllers, you'll tend to play more on the back line, setting up smokes while your team is getting ready to push in. If you're somewhere in the middle where you like to mix up between being aggressive and passive, then the Initiator role may be a good fit. These agents have abilities that are best when used for your teammates. However, they still activate fast enough that you can make some decent plays by yourself if needed. Like we mentioned earlier, each role is played differently, so we suggest picking a role that best fits how you would describe your style. Now let's delve deeper, starting off with Duelists. The biggest job of a Duelist is to create space for your team. This is especially true for Duelists with mobile abilities such as Jett, Raze, Yoru, and Neon. Take this double satchel play for example. We'll start looking at the defender game plan. Omen TPs on top of Rubble while Raze is backside. This is to set up a crossfire when players push through a lobby. Well, this setup crumbles with how fast a Duelist like Raze can move and take space away from the defenders. Durka starts off flying into Rubble at the start of the round. He gets there before Omen is even able to teleport, and the defender's plan is completely thwarted. Now there's only one player on site who has to choose between looking at a lobby or over at Rubble. That split second where they're thinking over their options is enough to throw them off and lead to an easier kill for your team. An important note here, you don't need to get kills to create space. Simply diverting the enemy's attention between locations is the goal. You want to prevent them from sitting around comfortably with their crosshair and setups waiting for you and your team to peek out. Being able to dash, satchel, or teleport onto a location far away from the rest of your team will split up the enemy's defense, which then opens the door for you and your team to make plays more easily. Now don't worry, we didn't forget about our Flash Duelists, Reyna, and Phoenix. These agents create space in a more straightforward manner. Blinding enemies with a flash gives your team time to push into a choke point or site. If you hit your mark, the enemy is forced to back away. Or if they're in an inescapable position, your team gets a free kill. Moving on from there, now because Duelists are the space makers, they need to be the first player on the site. If you're already doing this, great. But make sure your team knows when you're going in. We see many times where a Duelist runs onto site on their own, gets eliminated, and then wonder where the team was to back them up. Your teammates can't read your mind. They'll only know you're going in if you tell them. This heads up gives time for them to assess how they want to best back you up and position themselves to help. On that topic, also don't be afraid to ask your teammates to do something to set you up. Maybe you want some smokes on site, or you want a certain area cleared out with an Omen blind before you go in. Ask your Omen if they can do that. Or maybe you want to have an idea of what the enemy's setup is before you push. Ask your Skye or Sova if they could use their dog or owl drone to scout out the site first. Having assistance greatly improves how effectively you can push out onto a site. Despite Duelists being proclaimed self-sufficient fraggers, it's always better to push and make plays as a team. Moving on, we have Sentinels. One of the biggest rules for this role is making sure you have multiple setups in your arsenal. Sentinels are best played when they can surprise the enemy with their traps. If you place a Cypher tripwire in the same spot every round, the enemy will eventually figure where it is and eliminate it without any issue. Or if you place a Sage wall in the same area each round, the enemy will likely be able to predict where it's going to be placed. They can then shoot it down before it fully blooms and the wall loses its effectiveness. Changing your setup doesn't have to be complicated though. This could mean just switching sites and placing some basic traps there instead. Just this could be enough to catch the enemy off guard if they expected you elsewhere. At the higher ranks, you'll have to put a little more work though. This could include placing some tricky traps that the enemy will have trouble finding and destroying, or using Sage's barrier orb to boost yourself and surprise the enemy while they're busy trying to destroy your ability. Now, this doesn't mean you have to have a fresh new setup every single round. You only really need to change things if your setup hasn't been effective at slowing down the enemy. Maybe your setup was really good at halting an A main push, but the enemy has been pushing through A link where you don't have nearly as well of a defense set there. If this is the trend, then we want to place more utility over at A link. Or say the enemy has figured out your setup and is countering it. If they did it easily once, they'll likely do it again and run over your site unless you change something to better stop them. Now, in regard to how to properly set yourself up as a Sentinel. In this role, you always want to play off your utility whenever possible. This means as a Cypher or Killjoy player, for example, you don't want to set up your site and then dry peek a choke point. This is a 50-50 duel, and if you lose, all your utility gets shut down. The enemy will then easily take over the site and likely win the round. Here are some examples of playing off utility. As Sage, you can boost onto your barrier orb to peek an enemy. Players may not suspect this, and you'll be able to easily eliminate them as they try to flick up onto you. With our other current Sentinels, you want to lay down low until an enemy falls into your traps. If someone gets caught under your tripwire, nanoswarms, or trademark, that's your cue to peek out. You can easily trace these players down while they're caught in the mayhem. Lastly, as a Sentinel, you want to check the map frequently. In this role, you aren't doing all that much until players start to run through your setup. As a result, you should always keep an eye on the map to see if anyone needs help. Say we're defending B site on split. Our coverage of garage should be pretty thorough. Because of that, we only really need to check garage intermittently for sound cues indicating that the enemy is approaching. If we don't hear anything, we can focus our attention up over to heaven where you don't have as much utility set up. Our defense is weaker here, and we want to keep an eye on it so that we can quickly back up our teammate if it becomes necessary. With Sage, you want to be particularly active in looking at the map. If you hear teammates duking it out, you want to watch their health bars and see if they need healing. If they do, you want to rotate over as quickly as possible. But not too fast though. Make sure you cover your choke point before rotating over. This prevents the enemy from sneaking past your defenses and getting a surprise flank. Next, we have Initiators. If there is any tip to take away from Initiators, it is to call out your flashes. We've all been there. We're trying to push a site, everything is set up, we're going in, and then bam, we get hit with a flash from a teammate and the plan falls apart. It's one of the worst feelings. If you call your flash and where you're flashing, your teammates can quickly respond and position themselves so they don't get hit. As an initiator, you are able to make plays on your own. However, their abilities have a bit of a delay before you can use your weaponry. Because of that, making plays on your own is less effective than making plays for your teammates. So when possible, set up plays for your team instead. If you call out when and where you're going to flash, your teammates can prep themselves and use it to its fullest potential. Lastly, make sure to gather information for your team before you make a play. Initiators are the key agents in information gathering. This is thanks to abilities such as KO's Knife, Sova's Recon Bolt, and Owl Drone, and Sky's Trailblazer. All these abilities will reveal player locations and thus give your team a better idea of where to peek and use the rest of their utility when making plays. Finally, we have our controllers. This is arguably one of the most important roles in the game. If you've ever tried pushing a site without smokes, you likely know what I mean. Without smokes, there are way too many angles to watch out for. One of the biggest mistakes we see out of controllers is burning through utility too early. This happens often on attacker side. You pick a site to push and you smoke it off at the start of the round. The idea is good here, but the timing is off. The enemy will still have full abilities at this time and can slow your push with a simple ability of their own. This could be a Sentinel trap, grenade, Molotov, barrier orb, or flash. By the time these abilities have worn off, your smokes have likely vanished. Now you have nothing to cover your team for the push. Before you decide to smoke off a site, bait as much utility as possible. You can do this in several ways. 1. You can make a ton of noise towards the site. This will trick the enemy into thinking you're doing a hard hit onto a choke point when the actual matter is you're just looking to burn their abilities, and maybe take a small duel or two. You could also trade out utility. Say you're on Brimstone with 3 smokes. You may only need 2 of them, so throwing 1 at a common spot may also trick the enemy into using abilities to stop your assumed push. Your teammates can also help bait out utility. Making noise after using a rechargeable ability such as Silva's Recon Bolt or Breach's Fault Line could help sell your fake. If you have 2 controllers, you could really sell a play by smoking off a site with one of the agents. This is sure to sell a push and bait out abilities by the enemy. You can then save your other controller's smoke for the actual site hit. This gets really fun here. The enemy will have to take a gamble on whether your team is actually pushing or faking. If they guess wrong and think you're faking, you have yourselves a relatively free site. When baiting out utility, you always want to think about cost versus reward. The ideal situation is that your enemy burns more abilities than you do. That way you have your smokes available and your teammates also have tools to help with the sight hit. Now, on the defender side, you want to use smokes reactively. A common trend we see is players smoking off choke points off the start of the round. This is okay to do, but only if you feel fairly confident that smoke will block someone off. This comes from observations in previous rounds. For example, if an enemy likes to push out middle from links, it'd be a good idea to smoke that off to delay the push. If they decide to go through it anyway, they should be an easy kill as you get vision before them. You can also strafe jump to check for enemies before smoking. For example, if you're playing B Garage, you can strafe jump to scout for players. If you spot one, immediately back up and smoke out Garage to prevent them from charging through. Another point is to listen to your teammates' calls. Look at the map and see if anyone is in a duel and needs help. If so, have a smoke ready to protect them if they ask or look like they need it. This global map awareness is a big component that differentiates good controllers from mediocre ones. Finally, as a controller, you can utilize smokes to give yourself more space to work with during one-on-one duels. For example, if we're facing an enemy that's pushed out of A long and we're at generator, there's only two places we can possibly peek from, either the left or the right side. It's not all too difficult for the enemy to flick their crosshair between these 2 points. But what if we smoked out the center of sight? Now we have access to double boxes to peek or the right side of generator. This gives us much more space to maneuver between, and the wide distance between these two areas will make it very hard for the enemy to cover. They'll essentially have to take a big gamble and target one of the two, hoping that they chose correctly. Another way to utilize smokes for space is smoking off the spike when trying to defuse. If you tap the spike, the enemy will likely appear and try to spray you down. At this point, you can back out of spike and simply wait. Most players will panic, fearing that you may still be sticking. They'll then run quickly towards the smoke to make sure you aren't doing so. At this time, you can peek out to surprise them and land the elimination. That's all we have for today's video. We hope this gave you fresh new ideas on how to play your role to the fullest. As always, we here at SkillCapped want to thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.